So in section 2.3, we've been looking at frequency distributions and the related graphs. We've done two different examples. We're going to look at the second one here, do all the graphs for this particular example. So I'm just going to give you a recap of what we did in class, because Excel, when we construct the frequency distribution, it can only do the tallying. We still have to do the setup beforehand. So we still have to find our intervals. So here we've got a data set. 50 days, the low temperatures given in degrees Fahrenheit. So the first thing we did was we found our range, that was 25. The second step we did was we then found our number of classes, which we used our Sturge's rule. And we found that we needed 7 classes. After that, we then found our class width. And we found that, rounding up, we should use 4 as our class width. After that, since 39 was our smallest value, we started the very first class at 38. And then to get the lower limits for the other classes, we added the class width, which is 4. And then to find the upper limits, all we did was we took 1 unit lower than the following class's lower limit. Okay, so this class starts on 42. So the previous class ends on 41. The third class starts on 46. So the second class ended on 45. Just a note, your lower limits jump up by 4 units, the C, class width. If you look at your upper limits, okay, they also jump up by 4 each time because of the way we're setting up these class limits. That's going to be quite useful when we find midpoints and so on later. And then once we've set up your class limits, all we need to do is go tally. So this is where we can use Excel. So all that information, all that data that we had right at the top, here I've gone and I've typed all this out into our column A. And we want to do a frequency distribution. So I've got my class limits here. And for Excel, we're going to need our upper limits for those classes. That's what Excel uses. Okay, so my data, I'm just going to write where my data is. My data, the first cell is in A4. So it's in A4. And it goes all the way, the last data point is down in, let's check here, cell A53. Okay, so I'm going to go put this in. So this is in cell A53. So knowing this is going to make my life a lot easier. Let's go highlight that. Let's put it in red. I'm going to make the things easier so when I want to refer to my data set, I don't have to highlight it every time. I can just type in the range. Okay, so we need this column for upper limit. That's what we need to add. Then notice here I've got my steps on the side. This is just so that we can remember what's happening. So we've got our upper limits, our column. We want to select next the cells where we want the frequencies to appear. So we want the frequencies in these cells. So we have to highlight all the cells. Then we can start typing, and the command we use is equals frequency. And then the 2 bits of information we need to give is the data array. So where our data is typed. So we just take a note that was in cell A4 to cell A53, so A53. And then the bins array, those are your upper limits. So the range of your upper limits. Okay, so let's use that command. So we just start typing equals. Now Excel's not case sensitive, so I'm going to use lowercase r. F-R-E, notice just 2 letters and it's already popped up the frequency command. I'm going to double click to select it. And as I put my cursor over here, it says first thing I want is the data array. So instead of going to highlight all my data, I know I just put it in with cell A4 to cell A53. Now notice I'm using lowercase letters. Excel doesn't mind lower or uppercase. Notice as I've written it, Excel's put it in blue and it's highlighted all the data in blue, so we know what we're referring to, so we can confirm it. The second bit of information it needs is put a semicolon, is the bins array. So we want, what are our upper limits here? Notice it's highlighting, it says they're D5 to D11, and it's highlighted it all in red. So it shows you where it's done, and it's written it in red here, so you can match them up. We close our brackets. We do not press enter. We have to hold down Control and Shift and press enter. So Control and Shift, enter. And it gives me the frequencies for all of them. If you just press enter, it'll only give you the frequency for that very first class. If you then try to use the autofill based on that, it doesn't work. Okay, so you have to do it like this. Select all of them, put in the command, and then at the end press Control, Shift, enter together. Okay, so there's our frequency. Usually we don't like this here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to hide that column. So choose the column, hide it, and there you go. We've got my frequency distribution the way we're used to seeing it. Now we're going to want to do some calculations so that we can draw graphs. So here I've split up my lower limits and my upper limits for convenience. Okay, I've also done a column here for our class boundaries. We've seen how to find those. We're going to use them in some of the graphs. So I've just put a column in there for that. Okay, our frequencies, we've just calculated those. So we want midpoints now. Remember with the midpoint, it's exactly that, the middle point of your class. So you can take your lower and your upper limits, add them together, and divide by 2. Alternatively, you can take your lower and upper class boundaries, add them together, and divide by 2. Now, conveniently, I have put these in 2 separate columns, so I can use the autofill. Okay, select in there, and I'll press in there. I want the value to be equal to. Remember, I have to use brackets. I want to say this value that's in on the same row, but in column C. Notice it said cell C4, and it's highlighted in blue. I want to add it to the value that's in column D, but in the same row. So it's highlighted that in red, so it's saying in D4. Close brackets. We want to divide that by 2. Enter. So it says 39.5. So now notice that's a formula. And I can go take my cursor down to the corner, drag all the way down while I'm holding select, let go. And so I've used my autofill. So here, notice, double check. Halfway between these two is 63,5, or if you're using the boundaries, halfway between those two boundaries is 63.5. Another thing to remember, let's get rid of that. Okay, so we calculate the first one. Remember when we set up our frequency distribution, to get the lower class limits, we said find the first limit, okay, and then we add the class width 4 to get the next one, plus 4, plus 4, plus 4. And happened to be that the same happened with the upper class limit. So we found the first upper limit. So this started at 42. So the upper class limit for the previous class, so for the first class, starts at 41. Now you can just go plus 4, each time just plus 4. So notice that pattern each time with plus 4, which is your class width. So what we can do is we can actually say, okay, once we found the first one here, click on the next thing, and we say the value in there is going to equal whatever's in the cell above it plus 4. Enter. So now if I click on that, it's based on a formula. So I can say, well, let's go down to the corner, goes into a little black cross, drag down while I hold select, let go. And it gives me the same answer. Okay, so it's two different ways. This second way would be very helpful if we don't have these in two separate columns. Because notice the first way I did it is I referred to these two different columns. But usually you would have your limits in one column, like we've written the boundaries. So you wouldn't be able to use a formula. So using it this way, whatever's in the previous, above, add 4. Okay, so we've got our midpoints in there. We're going to use those. The last two columns, relative frequency and cumulative frequency. The relative frequency we're not actually going to use, but let's calculate it. So it's what portion of all the data points are actually in that class relative to all the data points. Now we should remember that there are 50 data points, but I'm going to do a quick check. I'm going to use an auto sum. So I select all of the values with the frequencies and one more empty cell. And I go up to the top on the right-hand side, it says auto sum. Choose that, and it shows me where what the blank cell was. It now tells me in total how many data points I had. So there were 50. I've confirmed I've done the correct thing. Okay, let's get rid of that. So relative frequency will be, in this cell, I want the answer to be equal to how many points there were in that in that interval out of, so divide by all 50. Enter. So a portion 0.08. If you multiply that by 100, you get the relative frequency percentage, which would be 8% of all the values are in that interval. Okay, but we're just looking at the relative frequencies here. Now notice this is actually done with a formula. It said if you go over into your column your column F, so it's on the same row, but in column F, and you divide by 50. That's how you did that calculation. So if I go to the corner of the cell, hold select and drag all the way down, it fills in the pattern. Let's choose the last one. So this 0.02, notice in your formula bar, it's saying the value that was in F10, divide by 50. So value what that was in F10 is the frequency for that class. So there you go. 2% of all the values in the data set were in this class. Okay, so that's quite nice. Nice and easy. Cumulative frequency is quite difficult. It's not just this easy pattern. We've got to show several steps to Excel before it accepts the pattern. So I'm going to hide a couple of these columns. I'm going to hide these two columns. So I'll select them and right click and then go down and hide. Because I'm going to use the cumulative frequencies based on the frequencies. So I don't want to have to jump across columns. Okay, so remember what a cumulative frequency means. It is how many data points have values that are less than or equal to the upper boundary of that class. So how many values are less than 41.5 or equal to 41.5? Okay, so how many are less than that? There are only 4. We know that 4, nothing before that. Okay, so for cumulative frequency, the first class, the frequency, equals the cumulative frequency. Now we can start telling Excel a pattern. So for the next row, our definition, how many data points are less than or equal to the upper boundary of this class? So we know that there are 10 that are less in this class. So they're less than this upper boundary, 45.5, but there's more. There are 4 that are also smaller than that. So we want in total, how many are smaller than this upper boundary? So we want the value in here is equal to, it's all 10 that are in that cell okay, that are in that class. Now, instead of using this value directly above here, I'm going to use this one above here, plus how many were before. Enter. Now, we need to show one more step in the pattern for Excel to accept it. So here we want the cumulative frequency of the third class. So how many values in total are less than or equal to this upper boundary, 49.5? So there are 8 in this class that are less than the upper boundary, but there are also 14 that are smaller. Because remember, there were 10 here and 4 here. So here, there were 14 that were smaller. Oh dear, you notice what I did? I made a mistake. I said equals to, there were 8 in this class, plus the 14 that were smaller. Notice the pattern that I've just shown there. It's whatever's in the cell next to it, and plus the cell above it. Enter. Now that's enough to give information to Excel. If we click on that, go to the corner, hold down select and drag all the way down, we get our autofill. Notice the very, very last class must have a cumulative frequency of 50 because by definition, we're asking how many of our data points are less than or equal to the upper boundary of that class. Well, how many data points are less than or equal to the very, very end of the last class? All of them. Because remember, that's the way we set up our frequency distribution. All of the data values, in this case 50 of them, must be in one of the classes. So by the time you get to the upper boundary here, all 50 data points have been taken into account. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm going to unhide my 2 columns here. So I select F and I, which are the columns on the sides of the missing ones. Press right hand and go to unhide. And got my columns back. Okay, so there we've got a table, and I've only selected bits and pieces of this table on the next few pages so we can draw our graphs. So the first is our histogram, which on our x-axis, we're going to use boundaries. On our y-axis, the frequencies. So this is just the histogram as a bar chart. So we select everything, including the titles, go up to the top, use the insert tab. Recommended charts. Automatically, it gives us a bar chart. That's what we want. So we go, okay. But now here, let me make this a bit larger. Histograms have no gaps between the bars. So on the bottom here, we have boundaries. Notice here, I'm going to look at the actual table. The top boundary of the first class actually equals the lower boundary of the next class. And its upper boundary is the lower boundary of the next class. So our boundaries are actually touching one another. So when we do our bars here, we're going to have our bars touching one another. So if you double click on one of the bars, see all the bars are now selected, and this format data series has come up on the side. Now you can have changing colors, some effects, but we want the series. If you go down, gap width, I don't want any gap. So I'm going to change this, drag this down to 0%. Okay, great. Now that looks like a giant blob. I want to be able to see the edges of each of those bars. So what I go up to my little paint tin here, and I have the options of looking at the fill, so I can change the blue if I want, but I want to look at the borders. And I want my border to be a solid line, and now I can't have it blue because I can't see it. So in the color part, I'm going to choose it to be black, just a standard black. If I wanted, I could change the width of the border, but I'm just going to leave it as it is. Okay, so yes, black, solid line. Why has this not worked? Oh, I know why, because I clicked in the wrong place. So notice here, now my bars are selected. I accidentally had this whole space outside where I'm running my cursor around, that was selected, which is why it now has a black border on it. Okay, so I shouldn't have done that. I can go to the undo and undo it, but I'm not going to worry. So I've made sure now I've clicked on my bars and made sure they clicked. So now I'm looking at the borders of the bars. I want a solid line. I want it black. No, let's make it a different color. Let's go orange. And let's make this wider because orange is quite light. Okay, there we go. You can clearly see our bars. I wouldn't recommend such a horrible color scheme, but there we go. We can see everything clearly now. And you can see your pattern starts low, it goes up a bit, dips a bit, goes even higher, and then trails down on the right-hand side. So that's our histogram. We can go now do a frequency polygon. Frequency polygon is just a line graph, and it has on your x-axis the midpoints, and on the y-axis the frequencies. So this is very much like your histogram, just your x-axis has different things that you're plotting. So select all our information, go to the Insert tab. We're inserting a recommended chart. Now we do not want a bar chart, so let's go down the listed ones here on the left. There's two here that we can choose. Let's see the first one. Okay, now notice in this little diagram, I'm actually going to make this larger so we can see. I'm going to select it so we can see the difference between this one and the next one. Notice this big gap from 0, 0. Okay, right in the corner of your graph, and your very, very first point that's been plotted is over here somewhere. Okay, so it's got this big long gap between your axis and the start of your graph. So it's doing everything to scale. Now I don't want to lose all that space, although it's not so bad. So I've got my data selected. I'm going to insert again a recommended chart. Instead of that option that I just chose, directly below it, I have this option. Okay, it shows almost the same thing. It just hasn't got our x-axis perfectly to scale. This part around here, where the x and the y-axis are showing, okay, that's not going to point 0, 0. Okay, so there's nothing really wrong with that. So maybe it's a bit clearer there as I made it larger. Now notice this line is floating. Okay, it's not actually touching the axis. And we don't like it to be like that. Stat 130, we don't like it. Other places you might want to use it. So let us delete, and let's make an adjustment to our data. So we know these are our only classes that we have. Okay, so I'm going to just scroll down a touch. Now let's suppose we had a class before our first class. So let me insert a line here. Where am I going? Insert. Okay, so let's make this pink just so we can see it. Okay, and I'm going to say, let's suppose we insert a class at the end. Okay, so I'm going to make that pink too. I'm going to give it some borders. Okay, now if we had a class before it, what would the midpoint of the class be? What were its boundaries? Its frequencies. Now we know all the frequencies are included here. Okay, so all 50 data points are here, which means if we had an imaginary class beforehand, we know there's none of them in there because our smallest data point lay in this range, which means within the range of this imaginary class just below, there aren't any. And then the frequency of this, it's not really imaginary. If there were a class at the end here, is also 0, because I know my last biggest one is in this class here. So if I had another class, okay, it would have 0 in it. There would be no data points in there. Now, we want to plot midpoints and frequencies. So what would the midpoint of this previous class be? Well, now remember, each time we were using the class width, we were saying +4, +4, +4, +4, +4. So this would be equal to the thing before it plus your class width, which is 4. So that would be the midpoint of this class that follows. Now, I could go write the boundaries in if I wanted, but I'm not going to. For this class that would be previous, okay, its midpoint, okay, so here you go -4, -4. This would be equal to this thing here, -4, which is your class width, enter. Okay, so its midpoint would be 35.5. Now, with those two extras, let's select everything, insert a recommended chart. Let's go to that one there. Notice it's now going down and touching. Let me make this a bit bigger so it's a bit clearer. It's now going down and actually touching our axis there and there. So we've anchored our graph, otherwise pegged it to the axis. Notice I'm not making any other changes like to the titles and the axes and stuff. I'm just showing you how to make the graphs themselves and the relevant adjustments. Okay, so the last one is our ogive. So here we're going to plot our boundaries on the x-axis. So that's the same as a histogram, but we're going to use, instead of frequencies on the y-axis, we're going to use cumulative frequencies. So here, let's see what happens if I choose all my data, our upper boundary, if you notice there. Okay, we will adjust this just now because I'm going to show you on your histogram, you did it as categories. Let's go back to our histogram. Notice we chose it as a category. The category 41.5 to 45.5. The category 45.5 to 49.5. Okay, but in our ogive, we're actually going to plot our boundaries, but each point. So we know that these two, let's look at the first two classes. There's a point 41.5 where they're joining, basically, the way you can think of it. Then here, there's 45.5 joins your second and third classes. Okay, so we want to plot boundaries, but not as categories. We want to plot them as dots, as points. So we got a line graph. So we highlight everything, insert recommended charts. Now, of course, we can use this option, which gives you things to scale, okay, in terms of your X and Y axis meeting at 0.00. In fact, I'm going to choose this. And it says this is actually a scatter plot. And indeed, this is a scatter plot. Okay, so officially, Stat 130, what we're going to do is we're going to go up to all charts. Now, you can use this in the recommended charts, pick scatter plot. However, you can go to all charts and here, go down the left and choose X, Y scatter. And then specifically here, go up on the top, it's giving you some options. Use the scatter with smooth lines. It has a little bit of writing next to it. It says scatter with smooth lines. So if you look at this picture, notice there's no dots or anything on there. So we wanted the smooth lines. Now, if you did do it the previous way, there are ways to get rid of those dots. But this is the way we wanted in Stat 130. So use the all charts, scatter with smooth lines, press OK. And once again, look what happens. It's floating. We don't want it to float. So to get rid of this, we're going to insert another row in here. Okay, let's suppose there was another class in here. Okay, so I'm going to actually write in the class. It would start at, now remember, everything is jumping by 4. Okay, so in here, I'm going to write, what is it? It would be, oh goodness, 37.5 minus 4 is 30, I can't even work this out. What, 33,5, is it? Yes, to 37,5. Okay, so notice your upper and your lower limits link. So there's my boundaries. The upper boundary I'm going to do here, 37,5. In this class, remember the definition of a cumulative frequency. It says that how many values are up to, or are smaller than or equal to the upper boundary. So how many values are smaller than or equal to this? Well, we already know that the smallest one is in here. So there are none that are smaller than or equal to 37.5. Okay, so notice here, this extra class that we've added in, when we look at its upper boundary, just take note, that happens to be the lower boundary of your very first class. Okay, so here we want to include all this data with this extra class so that we're going to be able to anchor our graph. So insert recommended charts. Let's do this the proper way. Go up to the top here, choose the all charts. Go to XY scatter, but choose the XY scatter that gives you with smooth lines. Now just notice there is this weird one that has 2 lines. That's not what we want. Here we want this with 1 line. So we select it. So now it's gray around the edges. Okay. And let's make that bigger. Notice it's now touching the axis. And that there is all our graphs that we're looking at. Let me unshare here quickly. And that's about it for section 2.3. I am now going to finally stop recording if I find my correct keys. Okay, goodbye.